So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Rettberg. I'm the director of the Center for Digital Narrative. And I actually don't have any, usually I have some multimedia to flash up here, but I'm actually just going to read some words to you. In a past life, during the period when I first met Joe, I was the co-founder of the Electronic Literature Organization. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this celebration of the research career of Joseph Tabbi, professor of English here at the University of Bergen. Joe is someone who you might know in a variety of ways, depending on the context in which you've encountered his work, and whether you've known him as a reader, or as a colleague, or as a mentor, or as a friend, or all of the above. Many of you here will know Joe only from his most recent work at UIB and as a principal investigator at the Center for Digital Narrative. But Joe has had a full and illustrious career as an author, theorist, and editor that stretches back to the 1990s and even earlier, to the period of late postmodern American literature and the beginnings of the World Wide Web. Joe's been here in Bergen for the past 6 years after teaching American literature for many years at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where Steve was from and where Eric Rasmussen was from. And before that, early in his career, as an assistant professor in Manhattan, Kansas, that is, after earning his PhD in 1989 at the University of Toronto with his dissertation, The Psychology of Machines, Technology, and Personal Identity, in the work of Norman Mailer and Thomas Pynchon. I don't know if anybody even remembers Norman Mailer anymore. But as an undergraduate, Joe graduated with both a BS in engineering physics and a BA in literature. And that's important because throughout his career, Joe has continued to engage with the connections between literature and technology. To move further back in history, Joe grew up in a small town in upstate New York in a close-knit Italian-American family, a part of the world to which Joe will soon return, coming full circle with his upcoming move to Rochester. Among other things, Joe is the biography of the novelist William Gaddis, one of the most important modern/postmodern writers of the 20th century. Joe's Nobody Grew But the Business, The Life of William Gaddis, is the authoritative volume on that important American author. And he's already been the custodian and shepherd of Gaddis's collected nonfiction and letters, with his service as the editor of Gaddis's The Rush for Second Place, Essays and Occasional Writings. Tabbi, I believe, also helped shepherd Gaddis's last fiction, Agape Agape, a dramatic monologue by an elderly man with a terminal illness, to its publication with Penguin Classics. You might know Joe as a scholar who's been consistently critically engaged with the various intersections of science and literature, as evinced in his landmark 2002 monograph on cognition and self-reflexive autopoiesis. Say that 5 times fast, Daniel. Cognitive fictions. You might know him as an erudite cartographer of the connections between postmodern theory and contemporary literature, in his between post-human theory and contemporary literature, in his most recent book, The Cambridge Introduction to Literary Posthumanism, which came out at the end of last year. In another context, we all know Joe as the founder and editor of Electronic Book Review, an essential online journal of contemporary letters and cultures, mapping, as Joe might say, the process of literature's becoming electronic, which has now been in continuous publication for 30 years. EBR was one of the first serious journals to be invented online and to be open access. And it has remained a critical locus for cutting-edge critical discourse, or bleeding-edge critical discourse, that would not, at the time, easily find a home elsewhere, and for methods that challenge the status quo, for in-depth work addressing the digital future of literature, theory, criticism, and the arts. EBR has served a critical function as it has and continues to serve as a hub for new critical discourse networks as they emerge and develop. EBR's work continues at its new home here at the University of Bergen Center for Digital Narrative, where our team is working with managing editor Ananaka and a newly reconstituted editorial board to assure that EBR has a bright future, at the same time as we are working with our university librarians and others to see that we have a durable and searchable archive of its past, which is so fundamental to so many of the fields that we work with. Along with the special collection that you see displayed here in the back in this exhibit that Joe has put together from his archives with our university librarians, and that Joe is generously donating to the University of Bergen. You might also know Joe through his work with the Electronic Literature Organization, where he served as president from 2007 to 2010, and where he continues to serve as one of its longest-serving board members. His work on electronic literature also extends to his work as editor of the extensive anthology, The Bloomsbury Handbook of Electronic Literature, published in 2017. Joe's work at ELO is particularly important in the context of the Electronic Literature Directory, which he led the revitalization of, and the establishment and work of the International Consortium for Electronic Literature. And of course, this field-defining work has continued with his work as one of the founding PIs of the CDN, where working with Hanna Ackermans, I'm not sure if Hanna's here, he initiated the new glossary of digital narrative project. My own history with Joe begins around the time we started the ELO in 1999. I had just moved to Chicago while on a Taft dissertation fellowship. My advisor at the University of Cincinnati, Tom McClure, had told me that one of the things I must do while I was living in Chicago was to look up Joe Tabbi, as he was the scholar of note in all things digital, literary, and networked. I dropped Joe an email, and as it turned out, at the time, he lived only a few blocks from the Westtown apartment I'd moved into. We met for a coffee at Leo's Lunchroom on Division Street, and I told him about the hypertext novel The Unknown that I had just written with some friends, and he told me about EBR and his thoughts on the networked future of literary studies. Subsequently, when along with Robert Coover and others, I developed the idea of establishing a nonprofit organization focused on electronic literature, Joe was one of the people with whom I talked through this notion and who supported it wholeheartedly and helped me to strategize its initial development, when many others in my life thought it to be an improbable, if not delusional, distraction from completing work on my dissertation. Soon, Joe and I were meeting regularly for a beer almost every Friday night, whether an old style at Jean's Place on Paulina or a Zivich, you probably recognize that, at Cut Rate Liquors, known to the locals as Cutthroat Liquors. Both of those beers, it should be noted, could be had for $1.50 and were thus suitable for an American graduate student's de minimis salary. They were working class beers for working discussions of the future of literature. At this time, too, a small group of us formed the Chicago School of Electronic Literature, which, inspired by the Oulipo, met for a meal once a month at Moti Mahal Restaurant on Belmont on Chicago's North Side, a few blocks from Rob Wittig's apartments at the time, for sustenance and sprawling conversations with a rotating cast of guest luminaries, all sharing our field notes on the emerging world of digital writing. When we did get ELO up and running, Joe's loft on Division Street, he had this great apartment, this open loft, became a local center of activity for this emerging field, a place where we would meet regularly for soirees, as Joe would say, with elit authors and novelists and poets and artists and scholars passing through town, a place where we hosted readings and demos, a place where the network that was developing online could meet in person and break bread and discuss and debate the potential futures of literature and what we could all do about it, and extend those debates to the broader field of contemporary literature. Joe's hospitality, openness, and generosity as a host is something that I've learned from and have tried to emulate since. While many of the networks in our field are digital, I've always found that the most significant and most lasting networks I've participated in are based on the in-person connections that emerge when artists and researchers meet together and share a bottle of wine, brewing new ideas and conversing late into the evening, while developing enduring friendships that result in durational international collaborations. When a few years after starting the ELO, I finally did complete and defend my dissertation focused on the network novel, Joe served as a reader and advisor, as he did for a number of other scholars who've written dissertations in this field who are now helping to help shape it. You have a very good hit rate in terms of numbers of your PhD students who've actually gotten jobs. My dissertation defense featured Joe as what in Norway you would call an opponent, chiming in with his questions and observations over a crackling old-fashioned speakerphone. This was well before Zoom, from Riga, Latvia, where he kept a second home, leaving me to defend my research to an inquisitive, curious, disembodied network cyborg who was always already a fellow traveler into the unknown. Jope's leap into and decades-long engagement with post-Soviet Eastern Europe from the 1990s to the present is another story that we could take hours to tell. Joe was there to watch the walls fall and new forms of democracy emerge firsthand. One thing to say about Joe's manner of writing, which I've had the opportunity to observe over the years and that I admire. He's a writer of patience, but one with a continuous sense of engagement. He has always allowed his ideas to gestate and evolve as a slow learner, in Thomas Pynchon's sense. And he has allowed himself the gift of focus. I remember that when he was working on cognitive fictions, his Division Street loft was almost entirely void of bookshelves, except for a narrow aluminum bracket he had attached to his home office wall. "Why so few books?" I asked him. "Oh, there's shelves of them in my office at UIC, he replied. "But when I'm writing, I only want to see the books that I'm writing about." Joe has always recognized that scholars in creative writing, that publishing, technology, and society all exist within a critical ecology, and that our interactions within technological networks are fundamentally based on human networks, to which attention must be paid and thought and care expended to see that they persist, just as we must likewise take care to see that what we value in the literary thrives in digital environments. And Joe, without fail, always has something compelling and provocative to say about literature in the digital present, and prog rock, and politics, and the evolution of culture that he has observed in his lifetime. Most of us gathered in this room today have known Joe for a quarter century or more. I was friends with Joe before I ever got married or had kids or was his direct colleague. Over time, we've met at conferences all over the world, from Paris to Toronto to Australia, and the conversations we began at Leo's lunchroom have continued across all those years. As my own career has developed and as he has been a guest at our home so many times, for so many dinner parties with out-of-town guests over the years, Joe has become in a way a part of our family. My kids have known Joe their whole lives, a recurring presence of kind words, gentle advice, and easy laughter. Some of you, however, have known Joe only a couple of years. It's a testament to his continuous interest in making connections that several of our younger researchers at CDN have become deeply involved with the projects that Joe initiated, and with him as a mentor and as a friend. Joe and I share a common interest in the constrained writing of the Oulipo, and like Nick, we also had the privilege of interacting on occasion with the late Oulipian novelist Harry Matthews. One afternoon, over the course of a long stroll with me in Paris, Harry waxed nostalgic as he told me about his friendship with George Perec and the relationship between memory and writing, and directed me to read, among other texts, Perec's book, Je me souviens, a work driven by the simple constraint that each short text in the volume, mostly only a sentence or two long, should begin with the phrase, "I remember." As we begin this event and launch our foray into remembering our interactions with Joseph Tabbi and the influence of his work on our own, I'd like to conclude by reading a small bit of Perec's introduction to Je me souviens. These Je me souviens are not exactly memories, and especially not personal memories, but little pieces of everyday life, things that in a given year or another, all people of the same age saw, experienced, shared, and that then disappeared, were forgotten. They were not worth remembering. They did not deserve to be part of history, nor to appear in the memoirs of statesmen, mountaineers, and sacred monsters. Yet sometimes they come back a few years later, intact and tiny, by chance or because we were looking for them one evening among friends. Rediscovered for a moment, arousing for a few seconds, an impalpable nostalgia. Thank you.